You're listening to episode 124 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Cynthia Garner joins us to speak about the new organization, Mindfulness Ambassadors International. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made available from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations, and if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations of even just the price of a cup of coffee show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. For those who have been interested in deepening their mindfulness practice in a secular setting, the choices have been fairly slim. Either pursue teaching or attend the occasional retreat. But more and more options are becoming available for those interested in continuing to grow their practice without having to become teachers, and a new organization is a way to connect with others. Cynthia Garner is a qualified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher and is participating in the year-long Mindful Teacher Training through Mindful Schools. She's a licensed massage therapist and registered psychotherapist in the state of Colorado, studying mindfulness-based somatic psychotherapy and completing coursework in her master's in counseling psychology and for the depth certificate at Regis University. She's currently in private practice as registered psychotherapist, body-based and massage therapist, and mindfulness coach. She holds a master's of fine arts in writing narrative nonfiction from Goucher University. As a Fulbright scholar, Cynthia conducted anthropological fieldwork in Guatemala and published a memoir of her experience titled Out of Grace, an experience that ultimately led her to her mindfulness practice. Our guest today is Cynthia Garner. Cynthia, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So why don't we start by just having you tell us about your background?
Sure. So I came to mindfulness through teaching. I was a teacher in the public schools for 7 years. I taught middle and high school, Spanish and English. And obviously in the classroom, there's a tremendous amount of stress, not only my own, based on what the workload was that I had to manage, but also the stress that the students were bringing in from their home lives, from academic pressure and things like that. Before I was a teacher, my background kind of went all over the map. I grew up in Baltimore, where I had an adopted brother and sister from El Salvador who came along when I was 7 years old. And that had a tremendous impact on who I ended up ultimately becoming as an adult in the fields that I ended up exploring. Both of them came with a tremendous amount of trauma And my brother, especially, tremendous mental illness. So kind of growing up in a household where adversity was a daily occurrence, I had to find ways from a very young age to be able to manage what was a very overwhelming situation often.
Mm.
I had a tremendously caring set of parents who were very supportive of things like making mistakes and just being able to do your best, and you can't do any better than that, and really allowing me a lot of exploration of being able to become who I was going to become. I ended up in college majoring in anthropology, kind of born out of that interest in other cultures that had been sparked in me very early from the time that my brother and sister came. I had had the opportunity to travel a couple of times to Costa Rica with a volunteer in service organization. And that was a very powerful experience that really shaped my desire to learn about how people are the way they are, and the diversity in the world, and how cultures develop. So that kind of took over my experience in my 20s, graduating with a degree in anthropology. I spent a few years doing contract archaeology work around the East Coast, from Mississippi up to Maine, and even down in Jamaica a little bit. And that was a really rich, rewarding experience. I also had the opportunity to have a Fulbright grant to travel to Guatemala for 10 months originally, and then I continued to go back again and again as I was really captivated by the stories and the richness of that area. So that was where a tremendous number of experiences kind of came along that really encouraged me to live life to the fullest, and not waste a single moment, and come into the present moment as much as possible. I moved to California after a few years of that, and started substitute teaching and working on a teaching degree, and then ended up here in Colorado, where I live kind of near Boulder, north of Boulder, in a town called Lyons, and taught in the public schools again, like I mentioned earlier. And when I left that teaching job, that was when I kind of turned towards the counseling profession, as well as mindfulness-based somatic psychotherapy, and began to really take on a number of mindfulness-based training courses, and enjoy the teaching of mindfulness as well.
Mm-hmm. So how did the idea of an organization around mindfulness, how did that come about from your own starting to teach to wanting to do that?
Sure. Yeah, so the second school where I taught was a charter school, and that was much different than the first environment. There was a tremendous amount of stress in that setting that I didn't feel was being addressed by the administration or by the counseling department at that school in a way that was supporting the students. My last year in the classroom was a tragic year for the students, for me personally. At the school, there was a suicide, there was a political election that was creating a lot of fear in the Hispanic population. In the school, there was a kind of shift in the curriculum towards making all the classes honors and trying to achieve very high test scores within a number of years. And the students were really left very unsupported, in my opinion. I also kind of personally was going through some hardship through a divorce, and I had a 2-year-old at that time who's now 4. And she was, an inspiration for me, really needing to dig into my own mindfulness practice. I started to bring mindfulness into the classroom to help myself manage the stress that I was experiencing, as well as to address the social and emotional needs of the students. And it was received really well by the students. And then by the administration, it was not received so well. And the principal actually got an email, why is my student meditating in Spanish class? And he couldn't answer it well. And despite my invitation to him to come in and observe what we were doing, and numerous attempts at sharing the neuroscience with him and all the evidence-based information that was coming out at that time, he actually asked me to stop doing mindfulness with my students. And that really turned me into an advocate in many ways. I became really energized by the frustration that I felt in that position. When I wasn't invited back the following year, I decided to put that energy into some place where I felt like I could have an impact, and created the organization Mindfulness Ambassadors International, with the hope of being able to bring accessible mindfulness programs to populations in need, specifically kind of keeping in mind this large Hispanic population that was at the school, and how their needs were really not being addressed. And as I had been studying mindfulness, what I was noticing is that the beautiful work of John Kabat-Zinn and Dan Siegel and others in the industry was written so beautifully, but it was also in language that would be very difficult for somebody without a higher education to understand and dig into in a way that would actually make the practice accessible for them. So my kind of thought was, well, what if I can create an organization that turns students kind of into ambassadors of mindfulness, and bringing this service component, this global citizenship component, into a mindfulness course that students could take, and then as part of the course they could earn service hours and be designing projects that would be really quite simple in many ways, but being ambassadors of mindfulness in their community. And it might just be acts of kindness, it might be bumper stickers, it might be hugs, it might be offering a practice to a parent, or any kind of thing. I felt like the students would come up with these fabulous ideas on their own. So the service component really kind of stuck out to me as something that was really important, that also wasn't being delivered in social and emotional wellness curricula in schools that we're implementing. So I kind of wanted to take it beyond stress reduction to how am I going to be in the world? I feel like many teenagers today, sort of the teenage condition, is quite troubling, and with good reason. I mean, they're being pushed into a world that's quite overwhelming and filled with crises, and with very few real coping skills to actually be able to confront the world that they're being pushed into. And so this kind of idea of being ambassadors of mindfulness really came to the forefront with the Parkland shootings in February. I was traveling at the time, and I remember seeing a clip of students being just tremendously filled with passionate activism and the desire for change and action, and for kindness and for love. And that really filled me with a burning desire to create a space where students could, outside of the classroom, could express their emotions around the state of their communities, the state of the world, the state of their families even, and be able to feel as though they had some kind of actionable tool that they were walking away from a mindfulness program with, to be able to enter back into kind of the real world. One of the experiences I had when I went to Costa Rica as a teenager was having this incredible life-altering, perspective-changing experience, and then returning home and not knowing how to integrate it into my school, into my daily life, and not really being able to explain to anybody else what I had experienced. And so the idea kind of came about that also this organization could involve international travel and service-oriented trips with students who had maybe either studied mindfulness already through the program or were going to study mindfulness during their trip and kind of engage in acts of mindful service. Even going beyond like painting a house or building construction, I don't know, something that would help a community, even just like sitting with students in a classroom and doing some yoga or reading a story and just being present as an act of mindful service. So I kind of just got flooded with ideas about how important these trips could be, especially if there was a way to integrate the experience once they returned back home with the tools of mindfulness and kind of under the in the role of a mindfulness ambassador. Like, I had this experience and here are some ways that I'm going to bring it back into my community. And it wasn't just something that magically happened down in Costa Rica way over there, but it's a practice that I can continue to use when I come home to feel a sense of power in my own life. So yeah, that's kind of where it started. And the program that I developed is called Mind on Fire. And I'm excited about it. We're still working on getting the first group kind of up and running. It's just beginning right now. So there's a lot of movement and excitement around that. And yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes. Where it's led me, actually, as of right now, in my own ambassadorship, is that I have noticed that there's really an absence in this area of mindfulness-based resources and trainings. So I've begun to start the process of creating the Rocky Mountain Mindfulness Center, and I've just established a space to start building a center so that there can be kind of a home base for that kind of work in this area.
Yeah, say a bit more about that, because that sounds like another interesting project that's part of what the portfolio of services you have are. Say a bit more about the center.
Yeah, sure. So as I started digging into trainings like becoming qualified to teach MBSR and MBCT and things like that, what I noticed right away was that I had to travel huge distances to be able to access these trainings, and that people in the trainings were coming from far away as well. And if I wanted to do the trainings in the US, I would be going to UMass or UC San Diego, and I ended up going up to British Columbia and doing my training with the Center for Mindfulness Studies out of Toronto. I noticed that there was this triangle there that was happening and really a big void in the middle. I also noticed that if I just typed into Google, Boulder MBSR or Longmont MBSR, which is another community near here, I didn't get a thing. And the closest class was like an hour and a half drive away, and it didn't start until, March of 2019 or something like that. And so it seemed like there was a call to be of service in a way that kind of went beyond teenagers and really bringing mindfulness-based programming to this geographical area in a way that becomes accessible to a wide population. So the goal of the center is to provide access to mindfulness-based programs for populations in need. And I'm hoping that will look a number of ways. I'm hoping that in addition to offering MBSR classes on a regular basis and teacher trainings up at some beautiful retreat center in the mountains here in Colorado, which we've got a number of, that we could also offer MBSR in Spanish for the Hispanic population. As a Spanish speaker, I have an interest in doing that. And trying to just make the programs more accessible also to low-income group of people. So have formed the organization as a 501c3, and am really optimistic and enthusiastic about building it, because I feel like the more support we receive, the more we can reach into the community with mindfulness-based programming. So it's just getting off the ground. We've just established a physical space, and networking a lot and doing a lot of outreach. It seems like there's a tremendous amount of education that also needs to happen in this area. Many people actually, when you say the word mindfulness, they don't know what you're talking about, which to me seems really surprising, being so close to Boulder. Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I have a belief that exactly right. It seems really
I would
confusing. Like,
think
why
in
wouldn't people
progressive
know what
Boulder there would be
mindfulness
a
is
little
here?
bit more of that with Naropa there and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. I do have a theory that Naropa and their kind of transpersonal and transcendental approaches have maybe dominated the
Hmm.
field,
Yeah.
and that mindfulness is something that right now is sort of reserved for the Boulder elite. Um, and so I think there's a lot of communities around Boulder that are not like Boulder at all. And so there's a real need, and I think also an opportunity to bring really meaningful programs and mindfulness work to these other communities that haven't had access to it before.
Hmm. So I'm curious, Cynthia, with all of this work that you're doing in this really quite amazing journey you've had since a young child, with a brother and sister coming into your family, and how that influenced how you grew up and who you became.
Mhm.
What has this journey been like for you personally in creating this organization and the center? What's that like for you?
Mm, yeah, that's a great question. Um, well, it has been tremendously personal. And uh, life changing sounds cliche, but really to come from, 2.5 years ago today, sitting in front of, a room full of 32 students who, half of whom were dysregulated, and
Mhm.
myself not having a real center and point of focus to where I am today. I feel like I've benefited tremendously from the practice,
Mhm.
and I've been really consistent about it, and I've been blessed to have the opportunity and maybe the discipline to really sit every morning and every evening, despite being a single mom with a 4-year-old. I find the time, and sometimes I'm sitting right in the living room while Shimmer and Shine is playing. But I'm and I really feel the benefits of that consistency in the practice. I've also had the opportunity to attend some marvelous retreats that were, when I went in, perhaps not what I expected, but just what I
Mhm.
needed. And to be able to embrace um, ideas such as I am enough, and I can't pour from an empty cup, and
Mhm.
being able to engage in self-care practices without feeling like they're indulgent, and things like just being really present for my daughter and being able to honor her emotions and her ups and downs in a way that really allows her to have fullness of experience. And I see in her ways in which she's having the opportunity to grow up mindful, which just makes my heart so warm and happy
Yeah.
to know that she has that opportunity.
Folks have shared this. We ran into mindfulness later on in life, and how being able to share that with their children, that this is a shift in what the generation when they grow up may be like. At least there will be a few more sprouted and flourishing seeds of mindfulness in society then.
Yeah. Yes. I think it's I mean, really, it's being a mindfulness ambassador in many ways, and that's what it's all about. And I think it was Daniel Ricksteffen that said mindfulness is contagious, and I think that he, in my opinion, he's a real role model, and he's doing some great work.
Mhm.
But his global literacy approach, as well as this idea that mindfulness is going to catch on. People are going to notice that something has shifted and that you're doing something different than perhaps the rest of kind of the busy rat race society is doing, and they're going to want to know what it is. And like they're going to want some of that. I had an experience the other night that I'll just share with you, because I feel like it was a moment in which I really noticed the impact of my own mindfulness practice. I was at a festival here in town, and the Indigo Girls were playing, and many people in the crowd were very excited to see the show, and it had just kind of gotten going, and we were about 20 minutes in, and they were doing a great job. They were just warming up, and and the crowd was just dead silent, everybody listening with every ounce of their awareness, and a little bit of lightning behind the stage. Nobody was really concerned. And probably within 20 seconds of that little bit of lightning, we were in a full-on like hurricane. And they were rushing the Indigo Girls off the stage, and all the gear was getting cleared off, and everybody was like running and screaming and crying. People were sobbing. It was a really dramatic event. And I was really noticing myself just being able to like stand up with the blanket over my head and just kind of walk calmly through the pouring rain. Notice when I got, underneath of the shelter with the rain just hammering down and the lightning that just was so intense and kept going. It was rather scary, I think.
Yeah.
And I didn't attach a meaning to it. I didn't make a story out of it. I didn't like get disappointed that I didn't get to see the Indigo Girls. I was just there. And I felt really like I was kind of on this center, and I was able to just kind of be in this rainstorm for a good 45 minutes before it was time to move on, and to kind of observe the screaming hordes rushing by me. And sort of the difference in the nervous systems of what was going on in my own system and what was happening outside. And I had a moment of like my ego kind of came in there, and I was like, I'm kind of proud of myself. I'm doing really good. Doing this really well. But I really felt like it couldn't have necessarily been that way without the amount of practice and dedication that I've been doing to the practice.
Yeah, and especially with the weather, folks who don't live at altitude or are not familiar with how things are in Colorado, and how quickly those storms move on, how really strong the lightning is, because you're in the sky already at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was quite intense. It really was. Yeah.
So I'm curious, in all of these ways of receiving and growing and changing and exploring what the possibilities are and how you offer mindfulness to the world, what's been some of the biggest learning for you over the years?
Yeah, there have been some really powerful personal insights about the strategies that I used as a young child to handle the environment that I was in, that maybe no longer serve me as an adult. And one of the most powerful has been around my idea of self-sufficiency and doing it myself. I've got this, I can handle it all. And how, that served me at a certain point in my life. And as I got older, what happened with that was it meant I wasn't connecting with others on a real deep level. And I wasn't able to really be close in a way that was meaningful. And that really became revealed to me as I started to dive into the mindfulness-based somatic psychotherapy work that I've been doing and learning. So kind of that idea of, connection is really important, and learning even about the neuroscience of dyadic relationships and mirror neurons and empathy, just knowing that in our society, we're really encouraged to do it ourselves and to be self-sufficient. And if we need help, it can be viewed as a sign of weakness. And that perhaps for me, like it's actually, it's not nearly as not nearly as meaningful or effective or powerful to do it alone. It's very isolating. And in many places in our modern lifestyle, we really actually encourage people to be very isolated and independent, and that's looked at as a very strong trait. And what the cost has been is human connection.
Yeah.
And the ability to really connect deeply and to endure relationships and to just be present for each other without judgment. And that's been a really powerful shift in my own relationship with others, being able to kind of arrive as my authentic self with much less judgment than I once had, with this idea that I'm enough, and it's okay for me to be vulnerable and to be in connection with other people.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if we might shift a little bit, if you're willing to say a little bit about Out of Grace.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Out of Grace is a book that was born from the journey in Guatemala in my 20s, and is really at its core, it's about our relationship to fear, with a little bit of the spirituality component thrown in. I was raised going to church every Sunday. We were members of the Methodist Church, and as a teenager, some of my strongest connections were in youth groups and with this volunteer group that took me to Costa Rica. That was a church-based group. And so when I went to Costa Rica, I had a pretty strong faith in God and in a higher power, and I read the Bible and I prayed. And when I arrived there, I started to really study the culture and the history of the people who lived in Guatemala. And what I began to notice was how much of an influence fear had on their development of religious culture, and how the Mayan religions had blended with these Catholic traditions in the years where the conquistadors were really, plundering, is that the right word? Yeah.
Yep.
We're really just ravaging the countryside and threatening people with weapons and with these beliefs that they had to convert to Christianity. And what's in existence now in Guatemala, in the Mayan cultures, is a really hybridized version of their Mayan traditions as well as Catholicism. And it's fascinating to observe these elaborate rituals that they put on, where they have a god that they worship. There's one called Mashimon, and this is a wooden effigy who is like a combination of the conquistador, Pedro de Alvarado, a Catholic saint, and a Mayan god, like the three of them all blended together. And this effigy lives in the house of the elders, and people come and see it. And the elders have the responsibility of keeping it clothed and fed, and they give it offerings. And there's a hole in the mouth where where Mashimon smokes a cigarette. And they tip it back every so often during these ceremonies and pour whiskey in the effigy. And people come and they pray for these things with such fervor and this feverish belief that, they're crying and rocking and moaning, and there's so much that goes into their worship of this wooden figure. And I think what happened to me as I started to observe these various traditions was I just kind of had this stark realization that fear was a big part of why I personally believed in, quote, God, and the religious teachings that I had been offered as a young person, revolving around things like hell and the devil and sin and the fear that I felt as a child if I did anything wrong, that like God would be mad at me. And so I kind of had a conscious walking away from my faith in a very vulnerable place. I was also in a very dangerous part of Guatemala at that time, where I would really hear like shouting and gunshots outside and glass breaking very frequently. There were armed guards everywhere, like in front of the McDonald's. And I didn't have, at that point, once I decided to kind of consciously walk away from my faith, I didn't have any tools any longer for coping with the fear that I felt. And I just became terrified. And then to kind of add on top of that, I climbed a volcano with a friend of mine who had come down to visit, and we went up with a group of tourists, and we were actually struck by lightning at the summit. And one of the people who was in our group was killed. And it was somebody that I had been standing right next to probably 5 seconds before the lightning had struck. So on top of this kind of rattling of my religious foundation, then I also had this near-death experience in which somebody else was also killed. And so the following months and years of my spiritual, emotional journey were filled with kind of searching for, how do I fill this void that's left of, like, how do I confront fear in my life? Praying felt hypocritical. And at the same time, I was in this country that was so plagued with violence and the perpetuity of death. People were so frequently exposed to such horror that they had kind of lost their sensitivity in many ways, from my perception anyway, to human suffering. And there were a number of events that continued to happen during my time there where people would be grievously injured and it seemed like nobody cared. And I just kind of went through a real period of feeling very, very lost in the world. And the book Out of Grace is the memoir of that journey, and kind of the experience that unfolded in the aftermath of that lightning event as well.
Cynthia, thank you for sharing about that and for the work that you're doing. It's really filling a few needs that are out there and will continue to grow. I think that what you had mentioned about the shift is that there is a need for mindfulness, and more people are waking up, no pun intended, to that need for waking up. So thank you so much for that work. For those who are listening, you can find out more about Cynthia's work at mindfulambassador.com. And we'll also have a link to the book Out of Grace on the webpage for this episode. Cynthia Garner, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.